Good morning, everyone. I'm Frank Feldmann. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at SUSE, which means I spend most of my time in, strategy, corporate development, and mergers and acquisitions. I love the panel that we just had. I heard some very interesting things, in particular around an active customer. It was something that I think Dirk was mentioning. I'm a little worried with Daniel materializing soon somewhere next to me if I say the wrong thing. So. But and the other thing that I heard was we need scale. We need economic scale in companies in Europe that can do this stuff. So I had a lot of points around that. Now first, who in the room here is actually a coder or has written code in the last, 2 or 3 weeks? So that's about, a third in the room, I think. That's impressive. I was expecting less given that it said Policy Summit. I thought, okay, I'll probably be here with lots of suits and ties and very few people that write code. How many of you are writing policies as a living or inspecting them, reviewing them, submitting them, or things like that? So that's a bit more in the room. Okay, well, we have one thing in common, if you want to know. If you write code, you probably have a hard time understanding what policy does. If you write policy, you probably have a hard time understanding what code does. So we both have a similar problem, and hopefully in this summit here we can sort of find a way to communicate a little better with each other on this stuff. Now, at SUSE, I just want to introduce us real quick in case you don't know who we are. We've been around for 30 years, more actually than 30 years. We make Linux, we make Kubernetes, we make management tools, and we do some AI stuff around that as well. But we're in the infrastructure space. We operate in over 40 countries globally, and we're approaching $1 billion in revenue. So you can actually get pretty successful with open source, right? In Europe, for that matter, right? Until last year, we employed 0 people in public affairs functions or any of this sort of stuff. 30 years we've been in the industry, and we haven't had people employed that focus on policymakers or politics or that sort of thing. I just want you to think about that, because some of the things when you talk about influencing and scale, playing in that game is an investment. It costs money to be here, to interact with policymakers and be able to represent yourselves. And for us as a successful company, only after that many years to make such an investment should tell you something, right? I would hope that the next SUSE doesn't need to wait 30 years to be able to do these sorts of things, right? Now, I prepared a little story. I'm going to need my glasses for this a little bit. Getting old, as my kids like to say. Now, I think Europe has a real problem, and Daniel touched on this, and I'm worried about this. If we don't have a healthy software industry in Europe, all this beautiful concrete and cables and chips that we're setting up for these AI factories and other things are going to be a low-margin host for very high-margin, non-European software. I'm really worried about that, to be very honest with you all. And I think this is one of the key challenges we need to address. It's not so much about pumping public money necessarily into open source, but it is truly about how do we create a self-sustaining European software ecosystem, ideally based on open source, but even if you're not, I still think if we can get it up and going in Europe, that's a good thing. It attracts jobs, it creates knowledge transfer and so forth. So I'll talk to those things a little bit and try to address that challenge with you all here in that sense. Now, you all know about Nextcloud, you all know about SUSE, Mistral, and Thales. There's other examples like that. I just think one of the key things that we got to remember, it cannot take 30 years for the next SUSE to emerge in Europe. Right? This needs to go a heck of a lot faster to build these giants. I think someone on the panel mentioned we need one, I think it was Mark, we need one big giant. I disagree, Mark. We need 10, 50, 30 software giants in Europe in all different spaces, ideally competing with each other. Right? But I agree with you, we need much bigger scale in order to do this stuff, right? And we'll talk a bit about what that means for open source, because it's not just about funding upstream. Creating code is, as Daniel says, cool. I still do it. I love playing with it. It should stay cool. But making code reliable, make it certified against all the regulatory requirements that a certain industry has, then supporting it for 5, 10, sometimes longer, doing it in an air-gapped setup. Those are sometimes boring jobs from a coding perspective, but they need to be done for these things to become viable, to be deployed in a long-term way. So we need to think about that. So let's not make 30 years for the next one, let's do it faster. Now this how do we use policy thing with open source first? I agree with that. I think open source as a priority is good, but Dirk said something this morning which you should not forget. You need to be an active customer. I've seen so many RFPs in my life where it's almost a cop-out. If we don't meet all the requirements in the RFP, therefore we do not go down the path of trying to work with that vendor. If you want to wake up a software industry in Europe, if you want to attract open source communities to do this, take a good look at the example that Dirk gave. He literally said, we are an active customer. If a project has the promise to deliver what we want, but there's not enough technical capacity, long-term support, or resources available, they stepped into that and said, we will partner. We're active in this space. Now, I had that as a bullet before I heard this story, because if you look in the United States, 20% of public procurement for decades have been focused on this type of stuff. US agencies often fund new technologies and show themselves as a partner in the process. Fast, early adopter, trailblazer, you know, those sorts of words. You hear them often. A trailblazer customer in my land is defined as one that is extremely demanding, usually also annoying, and at the same time wants to work with you on evolving the solution to, like a glove to their problem, right? If we here want to change this, the 200+ billion that we're floating across the pond now, start spending that on those companies, not just by having the same requirements, but show up as a partner in the process. Change the tender specs to support that, so that you can actually work on this together, and that will stimulate quite a bit of business development in Europe. So yes, open source first from the tech neutral stuff, but be an active customer is a key element for that. Sorry, be an active customer, thank you. I thought my voice was loud enough, but. There's this notion of upstream and downstream. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this, but in SUSE, we employ roughly 1,000 software engineers. That's a lot. They're all over the world. And then there's a bunch of people that do, you know, post-sales support, production support, quality testing, those sorts of things, right? That's a lot of people. And a lot of these folks work in the upstream community where the code is created, the code changes. It's high velocity. It's often a very unstable, sometimes not so friendly environment because people give each other good, solid, harsh feedback at times about code. Not everyone is comfortable playing in that realm. That's one part of our business, right, where we create the things that our customers consume in the end, right? And we work with our competitors in that space just as easily because that's what open source is about. It's open for anyone to participate. Where our value as a company is, where the actual revenue that we generate comes from, isn't from there, right? It's from creating a stable, consumable downstream product or set of services on those technologies that enable a bank, that enable military, that enable transportation, that enable healthcare industries to consume these technologies for a long period of time with commercial support globally, 24/7, with a security response team and so forth. That's upstream and downstream. And I think someone on the panel made this point for me already, but I want to repeat it. If you want to create a successful software industry with open source at the heart, when you do tenders, when you do policy, stimulate vendors or players that invest in both areas, not in one or the other. Funding an open source project alone, paying maintainers, is not a bad strategy at all. But as Daniel said, building a commercial viable industry around it is 50 times more powerful. That's what ultimately cements control back into Europe with the companies that we've built. And so if you look at a tender or an RFP or things like that, start to ask serious questions about Who is pitching, and are they both balancing upstream commitment as well as investing downstream delivery? Because that stuff, I can tell you, is not cheap to do. Maintaining a Linux distribution for 15 years doesn't come for free. Or setting up a security response team that supports all the major versions you have in production for that. Is there supposed to be a count here? I'm already over, really? My goodness. I'll jump ahead to the next point, which is my last one. Removing barriers. This was mentioned a few times as well. It is very difficult, and I can tell you as SUSE, I have too many tax advisors, legal counsel, and finance people employed in this company. Why? Because if I want to scale in Europe, I have at least 20 different tax regimes, labor laws, and other things to deal with. Guys, come on. This is ridiculous. A company in California instantly has access to the entire United States market without all these complexities. You want to build more big giants in Europe? Reduce this, right? I would much rather hire more coders than lawyers and other things that I have right now. If you're in that category, we love your work. Don't take it the wrong way. So, finally, capital, and then I'm done. Capital is absolutely key. We talked about it before. This is something you got to change. Unlock institutional funds to have much more companies like us rise. Late stage capital is critical in scaling. Thank you for your time.